So get this, podcast listeners. Nancy Pelosi has a $15 meltdown. Nancy Pelosi has a $15 minimum wage meltdown. So as we've talked about before on this podcast, there's a push, and there has been a push as well for many years, but there is a current push for the Democrats to use their majorities in the House and the Senate, and also having a Democrat president. There's a push to pass the $15 minimum wage, and they want to put that into the stimulus bill, right? Instead of trying to pass a bill all by itself that is $15 per hour, they want to sneak that in the stimulus bill and make the national minimum wage $15 an hour. So Nancy Pelosi is getting a lot of heat about this from her left flank. And so she decided to produce, I think it's a Twitter video, if I'm correct. And she put out the video on Twitter. And she talks about the $15 minimum wage, and she's like using her hands and just really demonstrating how passionate she is about it. We have a couple of clips on this, and you can just see what, in my opinion, demonstrates how unstable she is. We have the first clip, and here it is.
We have been in the fight for 15 for a while, and we were able to pass it in the House in the last Congress. But of course, the Senate, with Mitch McConnell would just not bring it up, and nobody thought that what's his name would have signed it. The former occupant of the White House would have signed it. So this time, though, with the Democratic House, the Democratic Senate, and that now what we are waiting for, this is our mission. We are going to pass the $15 minimum wage. That's the fight we are in. What is the timing? Some of that depends on the rules of the Senate as to whether we can be sustained. We are fighting for it, though. And what we're trying to make the impression on the parliamentarian in the Senate who has to make the ruling as to whether this will be in the bill is its impact on our economy.
And that's Nancy, of course, talking about the $15 minimum wage. And she can't even mention Trump's name, of course. It's the former occupant of the White House. And she just kind of jumps around in this tweet, in the video. She kind of just jumps around to different subjects and uses her hands. If you can't see this because you're listening to the podcast, in the video, she's like moving her hands around kind of frenetically and just really oddly. Keeps grabbing her neck and her scarf around her neck to show, of course, how old she is, because I'm sure the skin is probably all the way coming down to here. Here's what I think. I think if you can imagine a conversation in private between Nancy Pelosi and the President of the United States, President Biden, it must be really hysterical because it's like two people with semi-dementia issues, and they probably start a conversation and forget what they're talking about and then start a whole new conversation and then forget what they're talking about. So here's the rest of the video from Nancy about the $15 minimum wage, where she shamelessly divides people because, of course, if you're a Democrat, you have to divide people by race and sex, among other things. Here's that clip. Here it is.
To your question, probably 70% of the people making the minimum wage are women, overwhelmingly women of color. So when people start talking about, well, maybe we could have it one way in California and New York and another way in Mississippi and Alabama, guess who is disadvantaged by that? Women of color. We're just not going there. $15 minimum wage.
So she says, so here's what, I'm not sure if you really caught this, but what Nancy says is, the other side, they talk about, if you live in Alabama, or places like that, you really shouldn't be paying $15 per hour. And then she, of course, shamelessly segues into, yeah, but it's women of color. And they're the ones who are affected by this, no matter where they live. Folks, that is not true. It's not true. Let me just give you a breakdown of my own state, okay? In my own state, the Democrats, of course, have a supermajority, and what they always try to do is to pass minimum wage laws, which they have done in this state. And when they do so, they say, well, the whole state should be the same. Now, let me give you an example. The state of Maryland has a massive suburban population right outside of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. area is very expensive. The cost of living is very high. There's no doubt about that. And guess what? The salaries match it. The salaries are really high and the hourly wages are really high. However, you need to do nothing more than drive about an hour and a half to 2 hours west from Washington, D.C. into Maryland, and you're in Western Maryland. And you know what? In Western Maryland, you can buy a house for $80,000. Let me say that again. You can buy a single family home in Western Maryland for about $80,000. In some cases, you might even be able to buy a fixer-upper for even less than that. Imagine with interest rates of, let's say, 2.5%, your payment is so low that it would probably be incredibly worthwhile for some people to move there. Unfortunately, people don't want to move there for a variety of reasons. But the fact of the matter is, why would the wages there be the same as in the Washington suburbs, where, a single family home in some of the counties would actually be, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000. I mean, so much more, right? And just in my state alone, there's a great example, right? You have a diversity of wages, and you have a diversity of actual costs depending on where you live. And the cost of living in Western Maryland is very low, and the cost of living in the Washington suburbs is very high. And people want opportunity sometimes to move within their own state to places where it's a lot cheaper so that they can improve their lifestyle and maybe do the exact same thing they're currently doing, but maybe move to Western Maryland, right? The western part of the state, and buy a house for $300,000, which would be a really nice house, but then work via Zoom in your job and still get paid this high wage, which would, of course, help Western Maryland. But what doesn't help Western Maryland is when you have this $15 flat minimum wage and you tell people, hey, it doesn't matter what you do in Western Maryland, where it doesn't matter how little it costs to live here, you have to pay $15 an hour, in which case, guess what you're going to do? You're going to pay people under the table. Of course you are, which means you're not going to report it. You're just going to get a bunch of cash. You're going to pay them under the table. You're not going to try to comply with any of the laws. And this is the problem, of course, with the $15 minimum wage. It does not recognize the differences in the country. It doesn't even recognize the differences in individual states. And this is what happens when you have people like Nancy Pelosi, who are kowtowing to her left flank on the one hand, and on the other hand, also kowtowing to race and sex and trying to divide people that way. It's just really disgusting, and it just never, ever, ever seems to end. And I just wish for once people like Pelosi would take an Econ 101 course, like macroeconomics 101. But I actually think that she understands economics. I really do. And I know that podcast listeners are going to be very surprised that I'm saying this and disagree, but I actually think she does understand economics, but she doesn't care. She doesn't care. She doesn't care what it does to the country. All it's about is power, right? It's about convincing enough voters that they aren't making $15 an hour, not because of their skill sets, but because they're being discriminated against. And it's just disgusting. And that's Nancy Pelosi's $15 meltdown.